Among the many ideas surrounding storytelling, few appear as frequently as theme. Robert McKee, for example, describes what he calls the controlling idea as the story's central meaning, a formulation that feels both familiar and entirely reasonable. Most writers would probably accept it without hesitation. I certainly did. Yet, the more closely I considered that seemingly straightforward statement, the more an unexpected question emerged. If theme is the meaning of a story, then what exactly is meaning? Not what a particular story means, nor why meaning matters, but what the word itself refers to. The question seemed almost embarrassingly simple. Perhaps because of that simplicity, it had remained largely invisible. Meaning belonged to those words that appeared to explain other things, while quietly escaping explanation themselves. The obvious place to begin was with a definition. If the question was genuine, language should be able to answer it. Instead, every explanation seemed to postpone the problem. Meaning became significance. Significance became importance. Importance became value, sense, or understanding. Each definition relied on another abstraction that felt nearly as elusive as the first. Rather than approaching the idea itself, I found myself moving sideways through a network of related words. The vocabulary became increasingly precise, yet the phenomenon remained strangely distant. It felt less like uncovering an answer than discovering that the map consisted entirely of references to other maps. That failure suggested something important. Perhaps the difficulty was not simply finding the right definition. Perhaps meaning belonged to a different kind of question altogether. The more I reflected on that failed search for a definition, the less surprising it became. Language is remarkably good at creating the feeling of understanding. We become fluent in words long before we examine the ideas they represent. Everyday conversation depends on this efficiency. Most of the time, it serves us well. We speak of justice, intelligence, freedom, identity, beauty, truth, and meaning without pausing to construct precise definitions. Communication succeeds because our shared experiences fill in much of what language leaves unsaid. Familiarity quietly substitutes for clarity. The words become so deeply woven into ordinary thought that questioning them begins to feel unnecessary. That realization suggested an unsettling possibility. Perhaps the difficulty was not unique to meaning at all. Perhaps some of our most important concepts remain largely unexamined, precisely because they are used so successfully. The better a word functions in everyday life, the less often we ask what it actually refers to. It explains countless things while rarely becoming the object of explanation itself. Meaning seemed to belong to that peculiar class of ideas. The investigation therefore changed direction once again. The question was no longer simply, what does meaning mean? It had become, why does this question feel so unusual in the first place? Only after understanding that could I hope to approach the original question with any confidence. It was almost inevitable that the investigation would return to storytelling. After all, this was where the question had first appeared. Writers speak of theme with remarkable confidence, as though it were a perfectly stable concept. Readers often recognize a story's theme without difficulty. Teachers ask students to identify it. Critics debate whether it succeeds. Yet, beneath this shared confidence lies a curious assumption. Everyone behaves as though meaning were already understood. Stories do not define it. They simply rely on it. The more I looked, the more storytelling seemed less like an answer to the problem than a place where the problem quietly revealed itself. That realization changed the role stories would play in this investigation. I was no longer turning to stories because I expected them to explain meaning. I was turning to them because they allowed meaning to be observed. Stories became less like textbooks and more like laboratories. Within them, abstract ideas become visible through characters, choices, conflicts, and transformations. If meaning leaves traces anywhere, it should leave them here. Rather than asking stories for definitions, I began asking a different question. What do stories consistently do that causes us to experience something as meaningful? Once I began looking for the word, it became surprisingly difficult to avoid. We speak of the meaning of a story, the meaning of life, meaningful work, meaningful conversations, meaningful relationships, meaningful discoveries, even meaningful silence. The word seemed to accompany nearly every experience we considered important. Yet, despite its extraordinary reach, it rarely attracted attention. It was treated less like a concept requiring explanation than like a lens through which other concepts were explained. We trusted it to illuminate almost everything, while seldom asking what gave it that remarkable explanatory power. That observation raised another possibility. Perhaps the difficulty did not lie in the word itself, but in the phenomenon it pointed toward. Some ideas resist simple definitions because they are not isolated objects waiting to be described. They emerge repeatedly in different forms, across different contexts, while retaining a recognizable character. Meaning seemed to behave in exactly this way. It appeared in stories, conversations, memories, relationships, discoveries, and decisions, yet never seemed confined to any one of them. If the same phenomenon was surfacing across such different experiences, perhaps the question was larger than storytelling after all. Perhaps stories had merely provided the first place where it became impossible to ignore. Up to this point, the investigation had been guided by a single assumption. That meaning was something waiting to be defined. Every attempt to understand it began with the same question: what is meaning? Yet the more examples accumulated, the less suitable that question appeared. Stories possess meaning. Conversations possess meaning. Memories become meaningful. Discoveries become meaningful. Relationships become meaningful. The word remained remarkably stable, while the experiences it described varied enormously. That suggested an uncomfortable possibility. Perhaps I had been treating meaning as though it were an object when it behaved more like an event. That small shift transformed the investigation. Instead of asking, "What is meaning?" a different question quietly emerged. What does meaning do? The distinction may appear subtle, but it changes the direction entirely. We often understand a phenomenon more clearly by observing its effects than by insisting on a definition. Gravity was experienced long before it was explained. Life was recognized long before biology described its mechanisms. Perhaps meaning belongs to the same family of questions. Instead of searching for an abstract definition, perhaps the better approach is to observe what consistently changes whenever something becomes meaningful. If asking what meaning does was the better question, then the next step was simply to observe it at work. One feature quickly stood out. Meaningful experiences rarely disappear unchanged. They linger. A meaningful conversation continues long after it ends. A meaningful book alters the way later books are read. A meaningful story reshapes the significance of scenes that came before it. Even a simple insight can make familiar ideas appear in an entirely new light. Something seems to persist beyond the experience itself. Meaning leaves a trace. What kind of trace is it? At first, I assumed it was merely memory, but memory alone seemed insufficient. We remember countless things that never become meaningful, while some meaningful experiences remain vivid long after many clearer memories have faded. The difference appeared to lie elsewhere. Meaning did not simply preserve an experience, it altered the relationships surrounding it. Earlier events acquired new significance. Separate ideas became connected. What had previously seemed unrelated suddenly formed a coherent pattern. The experience itself mattered, but so did everything it quietly rearranged around it. The more examples I considered, the less convincing the traditional picture of understanding became. We often imagine understanding as the gradual accumulation of information, as though the mind were filling an ever larger container with facts. Yet many of the most meaningful moments in life do not feel like accumulation at all. They feel surprisingly economical. Sometimes a single observation changes the significance of dozens of previous experiences. Nothing new has been added to the past, yet the past itself appears different. The facts remain exactly where they were. What changes is the pattern they form. That possibility suggested a different way of thinking about understanding itself. Perhaps understanding is not primarily the acquisition of information, but the reorganization of relationships between things we already know. A new idea matters because it changes the position of many older ideas simultaneously. A meaningful story does something similar. By the final chapter, earlier scenes often acquire a significance they never possessed when first encountered. The events themselves remain unchanged. Their relationships do not. If that observation is correct, then meaning may not simply accompany understanding. It may be one of the very processes through which understanding grows. For a while, the idea seemed almost disarmingly powerful. Meaning appeared wherever relationships were reorganized. Stories reorganized events. Discoveries reorganized knowledge. Conversations reorganized perspectives. Even memories seemed capable of reorganizing themselves in light of a single new realization. The principle illuminated far more of the landscape than I had expected. Yet the very success of the explanation made another question increasingly difficult to ignore. If meaning arises whenever relationships are reorganized, why do some reorganizations feel almost trivial while others alter the course of a life? Not every insight becomes transformative. Not every connection becomes meaningful. The principle explained the pattern, but not its intensity. That realization marked the natural limit of this investigation. Observation had carried the question remarkably far, but it could not carry it all the way. We had followed meaning through language, stories, memory, understanding, and experience. We had discovered that the question itself was richer than it first appeared, and that understanding often grows through reorganization rather than accumulation. Yet one mystery remained untouched. What distinguishes an ordinary reorganization from one that transforms the way we see the world? At that point, continuing to observe experience alone no longer seemed sufficient. The investigation was asking a different kind of question, one that invited us to look beneath experience itself. If part 2 explored what meaning appears to be, then the next step is to ask how such experiences might arise at all.